Hello friends, welcome back to the Information Age Gallery here at the Science Museum for Fusion24. My name's Steve Cross, I'm the host of this stage. If you've been on the other stage, this is the fun stage. Our next session is called AI Amplifying Ingenuity, and some of you are thinking, Steve, that's not what AI stands for, but for the purposes of this session it is. I'm going to introduce the host of this session. She's Helen Brooks, she's from the UK Atomic Energy Authority, which I said correctly, and I would like a medal for. She's from the Advanced Engineering Simulation Group. Now, I'm going to ask Helen to come up in a second and introduce her panel. But the thing you need to know about me, if you've not been on this stage already, is that I'm a stand-up comedian. So when I introduce people, I expect you to applaud a lot. And if you don't applaud a lot, I'll stop the whole event, and I'll reintroduce them until you applaud for them properly. So, lovely fusion experts, ready for a huge amount of noise, please welcome to the stage Helen Brooks.
Hello, and welcome to what will be a really exciting session on artificial intelligence. So, please will you welcome to the stage Ian Hogarth, who is a partner at the investment company Plural and also the chair of the AI Safety Institute. And next up, we have Kate Royse, who is director of the Hartree Center. And next, we've got Tim Dodwell, CEO and founder of digiLab. And finally, Bordas, who leads the data science team from First Light Fusion. And before we kick off, just to remind you, if you're listening online or if you're just in the room and a bit shy, don't forget to submit those questions via the app. Alternatively, if you are in the room today, make sure you've got those questions ready for the Q&A. Okay, so let's kick off with hopefully an easy one. I'm sure with everybody, their devices to hand, AI is now in our pocket. We can do image recognition. We've got chatbots. So AI is now in everybody's lives. It's real, it's here. So now we want to find out how all of these companies who are involved in Fusion, how AI is currently being used in Fusion. So let's start with Raf. Can you tell us about First Light Fusion and how AI is being used in First Light Fusion?
Sure, thank you. So as we saw this morning, First Light Fusion is an ICF company. So our unique spin on ICF is that we use simpler, more efficient drivers, typically hypervelocity projectiles, but we also look at other driver concepts, and we move a lot of the complexity of the system into the ICF target. So a principal part of the business is designing these ICF targets. We use sort of ML and increasingly AI across the business. I'm going to focus on the target aspect because that's very much our core business. Just to give some context, targets at FLF have been pretty much exclusively designed using ML workflows now for about 5 years. We haven't had a sort of hand-designed one for a long time. It's a simulation-driven process. So we have hydro codes that do the modeling, traditional PDE solvers. But we really need to accelerate that process. Those simulations are extraordinarily expensive. That is in common with most simulation-driven design areas. So we rely very heavily on ML to do that. Before we get going, we actually do a lot of statistics. Before we even get to ML, I'm sure sort of the explainable AI, Tim will talk about that stuff later. We essentially look at the huge parameter spaces, we run tons of simulations, and we fit sort of ML models to them. They're referred to as surrogates, but effectively they're just trained on the data from the simulations. We then build those into optimization loops. We do a lot of Bayesian optimization, also evolution strategies. When we're happy we've got a target design, we do a lot of sort of testing of it in silico, we do a lot of sensitivity stuff, and ultimately it gets shot on our devices. And then we have to close the loop, so we have to really inform our models, make the simulation models predictive. That whole process requires thousands of simulations, and it's really, again, very dependent on those surrogates.
Fantastic. So speeding up simulations that are costly and accelerating design. So let's move on now to Kate. Can you please tell us about the Hartree Center and how artificial intelligence is going to help accelerate fusion?
Absolutely, Helen. So the Hartree Centre is part of the national labs in the UK. It's part of UK research and innovation. Hartree is about enabling UK organisations to use the power of AI and HPC and emerging technologies like quantum. Working with UKAEA, we're looking at the moment with a fantastic project called Farscape. And obviously Helen and I know each other very well because we work on the same programme. So what we're looking at in that programme is to generally to end up with a digital twin eventually of a tokamak so we can inform design. So part of the work we're doing is developing surrogate models, looking at other people's surrogate models and seeing whether they are producing results in the way we'd like them to. We are working with the national labs in America. So we've heard this morning about Lawrence Livermore. So we work with Lawrence Livermore and Oak Ridge National Labs in that respect. We're also looking at how we model plasma. Can we provide accurate models of plasma, understand how it's going to behave within the tokamak, and so that we can then start to work towards providing control models for how different designs of tokamak will behave. So that's what we're doing.
Right, so I'm hearing a theme here. We've got surrogate modeling in both instances, but now also operations. So not just design and modeling, but also really running the device. And before I move on, would you just say briefly what you mean by a digital twin? Because this is a buzzword we like to hear quite often, but what do you mean by digital twin?
So for us in Hartree, what we're trying to build is a platform which will enable engineers to be able to test out theories, and scientists and academics as well. It will be near real time. I never like to say things are real time because I think that we're way off that. And at this stage, it's looking at the experimental design. So in silica, you really cannot be designing in real tokamaks all the time. So we're trying to provide an in silica platform for the engineers to play around with to test out theories going forward.
Thank you. Right, so third, Tim Dodwell from digiLab. Can you tell us about digiLab and how it's helping to accelerate fusion with AI?
Yeah, AI. My mum thought it was artificial insemination, so because I come from the countryside, so I'm glad there's another one I can add to the list. Yeah, digiLab, the startup that spun out of Exeter University from my research group. We're building a product which is redefining how engineers work, trying to lower the barrier to entry so you can maximize the use of this new technology which is going like the clappers. We work in lots of different areas. We're particularly interested, so how models and data come together, and ultimately you're here to make a decision, right? And you use that information to build better products, get to electricity on the grid quicker. But really understanding how those come together. And in machine learning models, there's an element of trust fundamentally about how we use them. So we're interested in models that quantify uncertainty. Fusion is a game of extrapolation. Like we're building small demos relative to the bigger sort of eaters coming on board, which is massive. But that extrapolation, well, what might we think happen? What's driving the influencing factors that will cause design of something that we can't yet build? So the real opportunity that I see is this kind of journey from sim to real. We're in the area where we have hugely complicated models which let us confidently extrapolate because they're based on physics. But then if we're going to make big capital decisions about how we're going to drive investment or do experiments, how do we use AI to get the most information of that to be strategic? The other area that I've worked in is these things called transformers, which are not electricity, or they are, but underpinning technologies like ChatGPT. We've now built a large language model for UKAEA, and I see like there's all these sexy parts. Plasma is very sexy, but actually the opportunities to engineer to get the most out of their data using these technologies is kind of the productivity element to AI that we shouldn't miss. There's huge gains to be. Can we do smart engineering jobs that can focus on the complicated physics, but utilize AI to accelerate the journey to fusion on the grid? So, yeah, lots of areas, but yeah, I think common theme: surrogates, accelerating simulation to impact.
Very interesting. So, common themes, but also large language models, which is a different one that hasn't been mentioned. And I was very interested to hear that you mentioned trust, which is a very important theme, but we'll come back to that later. But first, I want to ask the same question again to Ian. Your company invests in lots of companies, many are using AI, and some of those are fusion companies. So what is your perspective on this question of how artificial intelligence can accelerate fusion?
Yeah, so I think it's great to be here. I originally sort of started out in AI and started thinking about as we sort of saw the breakthroughs in AI over the last decade and the scaling up of deep learning, the question that I was really curious about is kind of if you bet on that progress continuing, which approach to fusion will sort of benefit the most from it? And so I started meeting different kind of founders in different areas of fusion, different approaches, and I ended up sort of forming the view that stellarators were potentially, the class of fusion reactor that could be the most attractive. And I think that was at heart because the core sort of claim with stellarators is that they are hard to design, but easy to operate, sort of inverse of tokamaks, easy to design, hard to operate. And so I found an amazing team that was spinning out of the Max Planck Institute of Plasma Physics who'd worked on the W7X, but also a bunch of people who'd worked on advanced simulation projects at Google and other sort of more classic sort of mechanical engineering projects. And so I've been helping them as their lead investor over the last year to sort of scale up and raise meaningful amounts of capital. So I think broadly, I think simulation is the fundamental sort of opportunity here in lots of different ways. But I would also highlight AI for materials science. And so as we know, it just use magnetic confinement as an example, improving the upcritical field of a superconductor obviously has huge dividends for the kind of reactors you can design and the design space you can explore. And I think there'll be very significant venture capital over the next decade that goes into AI for materials discovery. We've seen the same for kind of AI for drug discovery, but now we're starting to see the same sort of set of approaches translate from sort of drug design and drug candidate selection to like AlphaFold to materials science. And so I think we will see new superconducting materials over the next decade that will unlock further opportunities for magnetic confinement.
Wow, so I love this word discovery. So could you maybe expand a little bit just on that aspect? So discovering new materials. How is artificial intelligence enabling us to discover new materials?
I think that probably the best parallel is with the work on protein folding. And so, you can think of the sort of, there's sort of 2 or 3 inputs into a machine learning system. You have, the amount of compute that you use, the kind of the intelligence of the algorithms you use, and the amount of data you have access to. So for example, the transformer architecture is an example of an algorithmic breakthrough that allowed us to use large amounts of data from the internet to train large language models. And so I think the insight of what DeepMind did with AlphaFold and AlphaFold 2 for protein folding was to take actually a really rich data set that had already been created by the academic community and then just apply some novel algorithms, but also a lot more compute to trying to explore the space more broadly. And so an example of where I think this will happen is, classes of materials where we have meaningful amounts of data already, and then you can start to apply these same approaches of sort of. So one example of this is the work that Meta is doing on catalyst discoveries. They've got a team at Meta that is taking a lot of data on novel catalysts and then applying the same kind of techniques to finding new ones.
Fantastic. So we've got this relationship with machine learning and data, but of course we don't always have lots of data, which I think is perhaps why some of the other panelists really emphasized, and yourself emphasized simulation, but perhaps as a proxy for data. So perhaps I could return to Kate now. You talked about this in silico landscape for digital twinning. So how can that help us to reduce the time to design if, in the absence of data?
The whole point with the simulation is that we are using physics principles in order to develop our models. I think you're very right to highlight data. It is at the moment, the big hurdle that we're trying to overcome is the lack of data. But in some respects, it's not just a lack of data, it's also digitizing the data that we've already got. So making it AI ready so that we can do that. And then the further hurdle then is getting around this trust element with our engineers, who would much rather we didn't do surrogate models. They would prefer it sort of more physical. And I think we have to work with our colleagues to get them to trust those models. So surrogate models, we're using experimental data, we're putting it in, and we're using physical principles in order for us to do our modeling.
Right, fantastic. So perhaps I can return to Raf, because your First Light Fusion is also using these surrogate models. So are you encountering similar challenges? Can you also elaborate on the same question of how to reduce the time to design when you're using surrogate models?
Sure. So access to data is, of course, of absolutely fundamental importance to this field. We're extraordinarily fortunate in First Light that we have a very active experimental program. So we can generate data in-house, and principally we use that data. We also would like to use more data from other organisations. So we saw results from NIF. They do publish, but there are issues in ICF around data availability because there's proliferation risk and the like. And I think as a field, that's something we're going to have to resolve going forward. Coming back to surrogates, it really means we have to make the most of the data we have available. I think there could well be some step changes in the surrogate landscape. The new work on neural operator learning, I think, has the potential to allow us to create foundational sort of models. So the surrogates I've talked about so far have largely been trained on single data sets. You build them up on the data set of the problem you're working on right now. I think the next generation, they'll be ingesting data from across the field to build a kind of foundational model in the way ChatGPT is a foundational model to allow us to avoid running too many hydrocode simulations.
Okay, so making the most of the data we have available to us, which I think perhaps leads me back to Tim. I'm sure you have some thoughts on this and perhaps how it relates to uncertainty quantification.
I'll try and say something slightly different because it's all there. No, in the same area, but I think it's, I mean, like physical constraints are really important around trust. If you give an engineer a machine learning model that predicts something non-physical, you'll lose them. So like actually just getting buy-in it's really important that you constrain predictions from machine learning models to be physically viable for lots of reasons, for good science, but just actually engaging the engineer past a point. The other really key thing about surrogates is it's not, no one has a model for the whole fusion plant, right? So what you'll see is there'll be industrial partners, Atkins, Jacobs, coming with more commercially driven models using commercial software. UKAEA, for example, Helen, builds models that are extremely complicated on supercomputers. Now, these two have to talk to each other. They have to work together to actually build a fusion reactor. So the ability to build a surrogate means I can wrap it up in a box and I can connect it. I can give you the information from my model, which you need in your model, but you don't have to be a super specialist. So actually, beside all of this, AI is actually facilitating collaboration and sharing. But then, Raf and I could share a model where he retains his IP. And, that's clearly, as we sort of mix commercial and, the private and public sector, this is a really important balance we do. So there are side opportunities in AI and surrogates in general which help us.
Right, and I think there was also a really interesting point that you touched on there of the need for supercomputing. There is no artificial intelligence without the hardware, of course, to run it on. And I can see Kate is nodding here. But okay, so embedding physics, that's one way we can feel like we can trust it. But of course, a model is unless you've got a model of the universe and you're operating at quantum field theory and modeling every single subatomic particle, every model has a limit. So how can we understand the limitations of the model, of the tools that we're using, given that they're built on models? So we'll go back to Tim.
Yeah. So this is I call this area active learning, but the best experiment, basically, so you have a model and it can predict over the whole possible set of areas under which you might do an experiment. Now the perfect experiment for me is the one that disproves the model most. How can I learn the most from an experiment? And that's, you know, if it exactly agrees a model, I could just sit, you know, I like the fact that I can sit in a coffee shop with my laptop and run models. I don't have to go and get Jet to do me a big experiment. So the real opportunity is asking the question, well, where, like bang for buck, I'm going to build a big thing and I'm going to spend a fortune running it. Where can I maximize the difference between where my model predicts and where the experiment sits? And we call this active learning, and I think it's the real low-hanging fruit about how AI and machine learning will support engineers do what they want to do anyway. They're the experts. We're not here to replace them, but they can just maximize this really important value. The calculations, I predict this will, you know, transform the time to market for these kind of solutions and maximize the value of our expensive experiments. So vital.
So can we use it to, if I have a model and I have an uncertainty on it, can I use it to figure out a new experimental campaign or collect more data in a certain region that might reduce the error on the knowledge I have available to me?
You can't look everywhere in experiments. So one question UKAEA often asks us is, where should we put our sensor or where should we put the camera to get the maximum output? And I actually come from an aerospace background and work with Airbus to actually say, well, where are we going to put the camera on this one experiment? What experiment are we going to do so we can see the ultimate failure of a wing, a huge expensive test that they do in safety regulation. And you could use models to exactly predict for this one hugely expensive test. You put the camera here so you could actually observe the mode of failure. And this is a primarily route to certification in aerospace. So similar questions. Actually, my route into UKAEA was because I was trying to transfer lessons learned from aerospace, moving away from test-based design to in silico design, which Kate said, to try and use this. So, you know, lots of important questions like, what experiment should I do? Where should I measure it? How should I measure it?
So using it to plan the experiment. So it's not about getting rid of data and experiments, replacing it, but supplementing it. So let's return, so that's at the experimental stage, but we've also touched on the design stage and the operations stage. So perhaps, Raf, I can talk to you about the design stage. Let's suppose I have used my surrogate model, let's say, to accelerate my analysis, and that analysis has resulted in a design. And now I need to qualify that design. Is it actually doing what it says? So can I trust that design that has been, that I have reached those conclusions with analysis involving AI? How do I trust that the analysis gave me the right answer?
Sure. So we're fortunate in that design process that we have the simulation arm as well. So if you come back to the idea of accelerating, once we get to a design that may have been accelerated by AI and largely reached through that process, you can always go back to the simulations, which you've run lots of experiments to kind of make sure those simulations are predictive and correct. So the first step would simply be to come back to your simulations. Ultimately, simulation codes are never perfect either. They're still models in themselves, although perhaps slightly more deeply understood. You then do a number of processes of sensitivity analysis, UQ, and that kind of thing. And ultimately, you decide if you're going to run an experiment. Experiments are extraordinarily expensive, of course, so you need to be very careful about that. You come back to ideas that Tim talked about, am I doing the right experiment? But ultimately, you can go back to experiment and qualify it that way.
Fantastic. And so moving on from design and qualifying with experiments to the operations. So Kate, you touched on plasma operations. So at that point, you know, you can't just pause it and say, you know, just stop the campaign now. I just need to go and check that the answer is right. So how do we trust it in an operations context?
I mean, this is part of doing your uncertainty quantification and going back to Rafael's point that we are providing models. So what we will do is provide numerous models, so ensemble type modeling scenarios, in order to understand lots of different perturbations and lots of different ways, and trying to understand how that plasma might behave. Looking back on the experiments that are going on today and making sure that what the results we're shoving out are actually mirroring those results that we've already got out there. And then there will be a point where we do have to actually do real world experiments. We can't do everything in silico, but what we would hope in silico is we're giving you the real best wins, the best chances of being successful. So if we can limit you down to, say, 4 or 5 solutions as opposed to thousands of solutions, that's going to narrow our time to success.
Right. So perhaps now I can conclude this section with Ian. So you, as the chair of the AI Safety Institute, what are your perspectives on the use of AI and trusting it? And are there any implications for regulation? I'm sure some of the audience listened to the previous session on regulation. So if we've got it's the question I posed to Raf, if we have a design that has been accelerated by AI, is that trustworthy? So could you comment on your perspectives of the trustworthiness of AI in fusion design and experiment?
I would generally say that it doesn't worry me too much, and I think it's just an amazing tool that will be used in quite a constrained, thoughtful way that doesn't present material risks around safety, so I don't think about that too much. I think that, the work that I'm doing for the UK government and the Prime Minister is kind of really trying to ensure that the UK is at the forefront of AI by making sure that we put appropriate guardrails around it such that we can sort of adopt as fast as possible without having some kind of, major downside event. But the thing that I would say, maybe highlight, that is sort of distinct from regulation is that we are going to have one of the most extraordinary data center build-out ramps over the next few years if AI continues. And so as part of the work that I do, I was the first investor in a company called Anthropic. I've divested from it as a result of the work I'm doing for the government. But just to highlight what Anthropic did, they were the team that built GPT-3. They spun out of OpenAI, and then they were founded in 2021, and they're now valued at $20 billion. Second most valuable private company in the world in AI. And so I've had a sort of front row seat to watching the build out of data centers. And the thing that really strikes me is, you've got Meta with enough chips to create a $10 billion data center. You've got Microsoft and OpenAI committing to a $100 billion data center. And so in the next sort of decade, you will see the most extraordinary amount of energy sucked to power AI data centers. And the people building those data centers are some of the companies with the most ambitious climate commitments. Microsoft is committed to being climate negative. And so there is going to be a window of opportunity to drag fusion onto or other novel forms of renewable or sustainable energy onto the grid, because you've got massive spend from very tech-forward companies who care a lot about their climate commitments. And so I think that in many ways, the regulatory worry that I have with fusion is that anything that slows down fusion may mean that fusion sort of misses this window where there is this extraordinary amount of capital coming in to try to accelerate new technologies.
So building on the momentum.
Yeah.
And I love this point that you sort of alluded to just now about the huge energy cost of the data centers. And I think it was Sam Altman from OpenAI that made this comment in a public forum that that AI needs fusion just as much as fusion needs AI because of the energy cost. So there's really a symbiosis there.
And I think the thing that structurally I think the fusion industry needs to figure out how to kind of collectively retire is the sort of fusion is 30 years away and it always will be. Because as long as that sort of sticks around, if you're, Satya Nadella or Demis Hassabis thinking about how you power this get a gigawatt of energy to power this data center, you're going to tend to orient towards solutions that are further along the sort of technology readiness level. And I think what's really fantastic about these executives is they understand how to bet on, huge tailwinds like simulation-enabled design or high-temperature superconductors. And so I think we have a kind of opportunity to collectively orient some of the richest companies in the world to say, okay, fusion actually might come online in the 2030s. How do we accelerate that? How do we bet on that? How do we actually plan data centers around that, rather than sort of being pessimistic? And
okay.
Yeah.
So lots of opportunities to be had, but potentially with that, lots of challenges. So just very quickly now to conclude the session before we hand over to audience Q&A, I'd love if we could just go through each of the panel members and just if you could tell us what you think the biggest challenge to adoption of AI in fusion should be. So we'll start with yourself, Ian.
I think it's probably just raising capital for fusion companies in Europe, in particular in Europe. I think that just fundamentally, the talent is expensive, the compute is expensive, and so we need to make sure that we have very well capitalized fusion startups.
Right, and same question to Tim.
I think this point about energy is a really key thing, and models getting too big that me as a startup can't run them, and I think that's an issue. And I always see it as a bit like the phone analogy, like Apple release a big phone, then they release a small phone, and then a big phone, because you always want what you don't have. So I'm actually seeing shifts in AI algorithms which are saying, like, I want to be able to do this super lightweight on a computer, and particularly I think this is the opportunity I see in developing algorithms alongside Fusion. So Fusion is a really weird one in the sense that it has huge amounts of data for a single experiment. But actually in the space of all possible experiments you can do is very limited data. So actually really models that are quite lightweight dealing with limited data are essential in Fusion, but they will probably be developed in a swing back away from these just huge monolithic foundational models, which, there are examples of startups that need 220 million seed funding just to get going, which is not really sustainable for lots of startups. So I think this nice twin of limited, sparse data, smaller models, and uncertainty are the way forward, and that's probably a plug. But.
Thank you, Tim. Same question to Kate. What do you think the biggest challenges are?
So I'm going to move on from data, because I think data, we know how to solve it. We just need more data to get in. So if we go over that hurdle, the next hurdle, to my mind, is that if we are going to accelerate the design of tokamaks and how we are going to design how our plasma is going to behave, then we need our engineers and our control engineers to absolutely trust that those models can simulate things that are useful for them to use. And I think that's the big hurdle for the next stage in what we're talking about. Because if they don't trust the AI models, then we're going back to having to build things that are going to be very expensive and very slow to change.
Right, so far we've had investment, data, and cultural changes. So Raf, do you agree or do you disagree with any of that?
I agree with all of it. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to remember AI has been adopted in the fusion industry. We are actively using it. I think to go to that next level of AI, the true AI, I want to pick on something up on something that Ian said, which is it's felt like fusion has always been 30 years away. And I think part of the reason that has been the case is that as we got closer and closer to ignition, certainly on the ICF side, new and exotic physics appears, right? And that's going to continue as we go towards high gain regimes. And really that then comes back to the data. AI fundamentally is dependent on data. Very few facilities in the world will be able to do high gain experiments in the near future. So yeah, we're going to need to generate and share that data.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So let's now go to audience Q&A. So we'll start by seeing if there is any questions in the room. So please do raise your hand. There's one here in the middle.
Hi, as part of my work as an analyst, I cover the materials informatics industry, so AI for materials design. And that's probably a more conservative industry, you might say, the materials industry than the fusion industry. But I think trust is kind of gaining in kind of the usefulness of AI in that area. So what do you think, I think this is specifically directed to Kate, are the reasons that engineers are struggling to trust these surrogate models within the fusion industry? Like, why has that transition been quite slow?
Sorry, I think we're all struggling to hear a little bit. Could you repeat it a little bit louder? I'm so sorry.
So why do you think, I think Kate in particular, the trust that engineers are placing in surrogate models remains relatively low within the fusion industry compared to other industries where they're more established?
Why does trust in surrogates remain low? Well, you mentioned that as one of your challenges. Perhaps Kate could kick us off.
I don't think fusion industry is any different to any other industry. What I see is that in order to really maximize the benefit of the AI models that we are generating, we need to work alongside our engineers who are going to use that in the real life examples, because there's no point us producing lots and lots of models if they are concerned about the the usefulness of those models. So part of that is about making sure that we have very rigorous uncertainty quantification within those, because we are dealing with critical systems here. We're not, we're not designing, say, with ChatGPT, a nice diagram or a picture. These are things that are critical systems to our future, and we need to make sure we get them right. So that's where I'm coming from. It's working together and making sure that we work not just on the HPC compute, but with our engineers, so that we understand where their concerns are and we can change that culture.
I also think that, take aerospace as an example, the Wright brothers stuck a load of stuff together and flew it, and they tested it, and I've been in a plane, you've been in a plane, so there's an element of trust. Also the analysis, the equations that underpin all that are well studied. It's linear elasticity or nonlinear elasticity. Hook started all of that off, right? And so there's that sort of comfort that when machine learning gives me a prediction, I have an essence, I can interrogate it, I can understand, is that physical, is it possible? I often go to companies in Fusion and they tell me all the things they've bolted in the equation. So it's not only a plasma, it's unstable, and it's this a sort of engineer's job is to sort of question and ask, do I trust this? Can I use this information? Can I design it? And so I think it's an example of extremely difficult field, and so therefore models which support this decision making don't come in and say, I've got the only answer. These are the possible set of answers that could possibly happen, are the only way in which we're going to see engineers truly adopt it. And thank goodness, right? They're the experts.
So trust is earned. Any other answers to that question? No? All right, brilliant. I can see a question at the back, please.
Hi, I'm Ian Chapman from UKAEA. So the panel rightly pointed out the sparse data that we're using. I think the reality is probably somewhat worse than that, because the data is really not representative of a power plant condition. So the data is not representative of a future condition. And then you also pointed out that you can supplement with physics models and then surrogates of those physics models. But we also don't know if our physics models are representative either, and whether we've got all the terms in the equation. So you're actually learning based on data which is not representative and models which may be incomplete. So do you just get garbage in, garbage out at this point?
Garbage in, garbage out. Who wants to touch on that one?
Happily, yeah, it's a good point. And I think it's going to be a repeat of a theme in the sense that you need the experts to. Models are great, and because they're sort of collectively. As a Bayesian, they would be your priors, so they kind of elicit all the knowledge of centuries around what we understand about physics into a model which can be generalizable. So it means I can just try different designs of a tokamak, and I'm confident that it obeys some underpinning laws of physics. So this is the really important part of a model. But yeah, I very much liken the explanation in sort of going into a dark house and finding your way. You can't see everything, you bump into lots of things, but really you want AI to, even though you know you're wrong and you can't see everything, you're trying to make those strategic bets where you can maximize your knowledge about the system and learn together. Actually, if you ask people at UKAEA, you might think that they actually want to build the perfect tokamak, but actually a lot of the experiments they want to build are the most unstable, in the sense so they can learn the most about the fringes of where physics is not well understood. So yeah, you can't generate, you are dependent on the data that comes in, but as a co-pilot, as it were, with an engineer, it's really about accelerating and maximizing the information you've got, which is all you can do, right?
Fantastic.
Maybe add
a quick one, and then we've got a question online. So yes,
yeah,
please.
I think also that I believe that startups are a very powerful way to sort of, they're a novel way to tackle some of these challenges. And so Proxima Fusion, the company that I'm an investor in, they spun out from the Max Planck Institute Plasma Physics about a year ago, raised quite a significant amount of venture capital, and have basically been building a sort of simulation-first approach to accelerators. And they've been comparing their results with the accelerator optimization team at the W7X, and they've seen the ability to get to parity by bringing in a bunch of additional techniques from companies like Google or Tesla in terms of certain approaches. And so I think that like startups are a very interesting way to sort of attack a problem in a slightly different way. And I think a good example of that would be DeepMind's work on AlphaFold, which basically took a field that had been kind of moving forward at a certain pace and sort of shocked it into a different level. And I think that potential exists in Fusion too.
Fantastic. So I think we've got time for one more question. So I believe there's one online. I'm struggling with the iPad. So for a bunch of people who are really invested in computers, it's amazing how I'm struggling with technology. Is it possible to get a microphone up? Ah, lovely. Fantastic. Right. So what about using AI for controlling plasma within a tokamak? I think, so we touched, we did, so Kate, do you want to go back to that point? Fantastic.
Well, the point is that part of the work that Hartree is working on, and probably a whole load of other people as well, because we're not the only ones in the field, is looking at how do we control plasma within a tokamak. But we go back to what we were talking about before, which is the fact that we're dealing with the porosity of data. We're trying to knock out the total wacky ideas to pull into accelerate the discovery around what we think are the sort of closer to what will actually work. And that's where AI is providing the real benefits here. It's not about giving you the end solution. It's about telling you which ones, a bit like protein folding, which ones are more likely to be successful so that our engineers are not wasting their time on things that will definitely not work.
You've got to design a controlled system, right? So you can't post hoc put the control on the back end to build it. And so you need algorithms, even if they're quite simple. I mean, DeepMind were really kind of pioneered the work in reinforcement learning, which is the sort of machine learning equivalent of training a dog. You give it a cookie when it does well, basically. And but it's really interesting in these controlled systems that you can't think about that afterwards. It's an essential part. So you need even simple control algorithms early doors to make efforts going forward.
I think going forward, everything we're doing at the moment is learning. So we're learning, failing, learning, failing, learning, failing, and eventually we'll have success. But it's the speed at which we turn that over that's important, which is why we're using AI to do this, so that we can accelerate it.
Can I add a comment? Not directly about tokamak control, but we talk a lot about design optimization, and as ICF moves towards IFE, actually, we're going to start to gain control problems. So as we move to a high rep rate regime, control will become incredibly important for us. As Tammy Ma said this morning, perhaps the IFE community is a touch behind on that compared to the MCF community. And actually, I'm looking forward to seeing the work that's coming through, and I think we'll learn a lot from it.
Well, fantastic. So we've heard a lot about challenges, but more about opportunities. So hopefully you'll go away with feeling inspired from this session. But now I'm sure you're all ready for lunch. So let's thank the panelists.